Hello, and thank you for joining us for our fourth webinar, Webinar Wednesday. Today we are happy to welcome Felicia Garcia, who is the Education Curator at the School for Advanced Research's Indian Arts Research Center. She is a member of the Santa Ynez Band of Chumash Indians and grew up on her tribe's reservation in Southern California. As the Curator of Education, she oversees the Education Department at the IARC, including the Anne Ray Internship Program and community outreach efforts. She received a BA in Psychology from Willamette University and an MA in Museum Studies from New York University. In 2018, she published The Guide to Indigenous Land and Territorial Acknowledgements for Cultural Institutions, which is available at landacknowledgements.org, with the hope that this resource would encourage institutions to recognize and respect Indigenous homelands and inherent sovereignty. Just before I turn it over to Felicia, I wanted to invite you back next Wednesday for a talk with Angelo Baca on Bears Ears, the vision for an Indigenous National Monument. So now I'm going to turn it over to Felicia Garcia. Thanks for joining us, Felicia.
Hi, Andy. Thank you for the introduction. It's really great to be here. Right, so I'll just start by introducing myself. Haku, everyone. Maktuka, Felicia, Alap Shamala Shumash, Alapu, Kalawasha, Kashjo, Iti. So hello, my name is Felicia Garcia. I'm Somala Shumash. I'm from the village of Kalawashak, which is in Santa Ynez, California, and I'm very happy to be here with you today. So before I begin, I would like to express my gratitude to the Tewa people as the original stewards of the land on which I have the great privilege to live on as a guest and give this presentation from today. I want to acknowledge their withstanding connection to this place, which is also known as Ogapoge, and I invite you to join me in paying respect to the Tewa elders of both the past and present, as well as living descendants and future generations who will continue to maintain inseparable ties to this place. And since this is a virtual talk, I'm going to assume some of you are not viewing from the place that is currently recognized as Santa Fe. So I ask you to take a moment and to reflect on the history of the land that you occupy and the communities that have an ancestral connection to it. Right, so I'm gonna start by sharing a bit of my screen. Oh, hey Andy, it looks like my screen sharing is disabled.
Okay, how about now?
Okay, yes, there we go, thank you.
Sure.
All right, sorry, let me just, all right. Sorry for the technical difficulties, folks. This is my very first Zoom lecture. All right. So today I'm here to share a bit about my research on Indigenous land acknowledgement, which is a continuation of the work that I began for my master's thesis while I was at New York University in 2017. And just before I get into it, I want to say that I don't speak for all Indigenous people, and I don't even speak for my own community. And this is something that I like to emphasize, especially as a guest here in Pueblo territory. All of my research has been completed from my own perspective, which has been shaped by my community and culture, as well as an education in Western institutions. So in my thesis, I argued that Indigenous land acknowledgement should become commonplace in mainstream museum institutions as a step toward reparation for the harm caused by over a century of harmful collecting practices and misrepresentation of Indigenous people, as well as the denial of the right for Indigenous people to participate in the telling of their own narratives. These statements to me reflect respect for Indigenous voices, acknowledgement of the dark truths of United States history, and demonstrate that in most cases, Indigenous people are still here to tell their story. So to me, this work was more than just a thesis topic. As an Indigenous person, I've gone my entire life not feeling seen by mainstream museum institutions, or exactly, sorry. When I pursued my master's degree, I wanted to do something that would lead to change that might improve visibility and representation for Indigenous people. So after completing my thesis, I worked with one of my professors, Dr. Jane Anderson, to publish a short 2-page, one piece of paper front and back guide to Indigenous land acknowledgement, specifically for cultural institutions. As Andy mentioned, you can find the guide at indigenouslandAcknowledgements.org, and here is a little screenshot of what the website looks like. There is a PDF that you can download, and then also some links here of helpful resources. So I wanted to create something that would be more accessible than my 75-page paper. Like I said, it was my hope that my thesis project would turn into something that would lead to the actual implementation of new protocols in museums. It was my vision to create an easily digestible but informative guide to Indigenous land acknowledgement that would only take up a single sheet of paper. So here is the full guide here. I normally have a few hard copies with me to hand out, but unfortunately today I'll just have to point you all to the website. As you can see, my verbiage has changed over time. I originally addressed museums and then published a guide for cultural institutions. And today, the title of my talk specifies collecting institutions, which includes museums, libraries, archives, and universities. I'll talk a little bit more about why I believe these institutions have a unique responsibility to practice acknowledgement a little bit later in the presentation. So as you can see, the guide includes sections with the following titles. It's meant to be sort of an intro or FAQ about land acknowledgement. So the titles are, what is Indigenous land or territorial acknowledgement? Why are Indigenous land and territorial acknowledgements important? Why cultural institutions? And suggestions for creating your land or territorial acknowledgement with an example, and then a resource section at the end. So I'll just also read the example here so you can get another idea of what these sound like if you aren't too familiar. So on the guide, the example says, we are gathered on the unceded land of the fill-in-the-blank peoples. I ask you to join me in acknowledging that community, their elders, both past and present, as well as future generations. This institution also acknowledges that it was founded upon exclusions and erasures of many Indigenous peoples, including those on whose land this institution is located. This acknowledgement demonstrates a commitment to beginning the process of working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. So that's definitely not meant to be a template to use, but just an example. And also, I wanted to point out some of the resources here. I don't know if you can see it too well, but the first one links to the United States Department of Art and Culture's Honor Native Land Guide. That was released in October of 2017, I believe. It's really comprehensive, and I like to include it here because it's a more extensive resource than my guide, and I just like to emphasize that this guide that I made is meant to be a complement to that guide. It's not meant to be an alternative, and so I definitely suggest checking that one out. You'll also see the SAR guidelines for collaboration on here. I actually put this on here before I even applied for an internship at SAR. I think it's a really great resource, and the ultimate goal of implementing these acknowledgements is to develop or strengthen relationships between cultural institutions and Indigenous communities. And so I think the guidelines to collaboration are a really great resource to take that to the next step. But then the resource that I really wanted to talk about is this one here, the nativeland.ca. So I wanted to point this one out because I get a lot of emails from different people in different places asking me who the right community to acknowledge is. And just like most people, I'm not a history or Indigenous geography expert, so I don't have the answers a lot of the time. I'll do my best to help out or point people to resources when I can, but I think that doing the research yourself is an important part of the work. So I think this website is really great. You can search your location. Here's a little look at what the website looks like. You can search your location and you can select either territories, languages, or treaties to view on the map. As you can see, see I have the territories button turned on here. There are a lot of different territories in so-called North America here. There's a lot of overlap. So sometimes it's appropriate to acknowledge more than one group. Earlier I did a search for the Museum of Indian Arts and Culture here, just to show you an example. And as you can see, sometimes it's not perfect because here it just says Pueblo. It also says Hickory Apache, but ideally you would have a more specific acknowledgement. So this resource is a really great starting point. I use it all the time when I travel because there's an app that you can download to your phone, but it's important to always supplement with your own research. So I just like to point that out. And so to start our conversation about land acknowledgement, I just wanted to give a little bit of background information and provide a brief overview about the statements. I'm sure many of you already know, especially I'm hoping that there's some Indigenous folks in, so obviously they're familiar. And then being in Santa Fe, I've seen these statements implemented at a lot of institutions and events. So I'm sure many of you know, but for those who might be less familiar, an Indigenous land acknowledgement is a statement that recognizes the Indigenous people who have an ancestral connection to the land on which a meeting or event takes place. I gave an example at the very beginning of this presentation, and then another one in the guide. And while this practice traditionally has taken a verbal form, I believe that museums and other cultural institutions should also implement a permanent material version in the form of a panel or plaque due to the ephemerality of verbal statements. These statements are often criticized because they can become habitual gestures that lose their sincerity over time or through repetition. Additionally, the individual giving the statement might not speak for a particular institution, but having a permanent plaque in a prominent location would be a significant representation of an institution's values. Further, having a permanent visible iteration of this acknowledgement creates a sense of accountability for the institution to be held to a set of standards regarding their relationship with Indigenous people. So here are two other examples, just so you can see how diverse these statements can be. I used to talk about the standard format of land acknowledgement statements because they do tend to take on a similar kind of cookie cutter form, but I really don't want to encourage that. So here is one statement that I worked on for the Council for Museum Anthropology conference that was held here on Museum Hill last fall. It reads, this geographic region in which we are gathered is home to 19 Pueblo communities and many other tribes and nations. Specifically, we are meeting today in Ogopoge within the Tewa world. We ask you to join us in acknowledging these communities, past, present, and future, as well as their withstanding connections to this place. We hope that you'll take the time to learn more about the Indigenous peoples of this region by visiting some of our local cultural institutions, such as the Museum of Indian Arts and Culture, the Poe Cultural Center, and the Indian Pueblo Cultural Center. As you can see, we made it really specific to the audience that was in attendance, which I think is really important, making these really specific and context-based. And here's a post that I wanted to share from my friend and colleague, Dr. Miranda Roberts, who is a Numu scholar at the Field Museum. So she posted the other day about her new approach to acknowledgement, which I thought was really great and really gives an example about how we can begin to speak to the broader effects of colonialism with these statements. So I'll just read what she wrote here in her post. She said, I've decided to do land acknowledgements a little differently these days. After I honor Indigenous people, I'm going to hit my audience with this quote by Angela Davis, with credit, of course. I'm also going to provide the audience with donation links for groups supporting Black lives, Indigenous rights, bail money needs, food banks, and women's shelters. So the quote that she plans to share is, we know the historical process of colonization was a violent conquest of human beings and the land they stewarded. It is thus essential that we identify the genocidal assaults on the first peoples of this land as the foundational arena for the many forms of state and vigilante justice that followed. Moreover, the violence of European colonization, including the slave trade, constitutes the common history of Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and the American hemisphere. In other words, there is a longer and larger history of the violence we witness today. Our understandings of and resistance to contemporary modes of racist violence should thus be sufficiently capacious to acknowledge the embeddedness of historical violence, of settler colonial violence against Native Americans, and the violence of slavery inflicted on Africans. So again, these can be really broad. They do not have to follow a specific form by any means. And I think the important thing about both of these is that they include an action. They're not just an acknowledgement. So the CMA one is encouraging people in attendance to go to museums to learn about the Indigenous people who are from this place. It's not just an acknowledgement, it's asking people to take initiative and do something. Similarly to Miranda, she has noted that she's going to be posting donation links or sharing donation links when she does these. So I think that's a really important element of these statements that can really take it to a more meaningful level. I've also heard people read poems or tell stories with their acknowledgements. So it can take a lot of different forms, and I just want everyone to feel empowered to create their own statements as long as they're sincere and meaningful. And just before I get too far into it, I just wanted to make a quick note about terminology. While the practice of Indigenous land acknowledgement is fairly new to mainstream museum institutions, it has long been an established protocol among Indigenous populations all over the world. It has even made it into the mainstream in both Canada and Australia. There is no single definitive term that is used to describe the statement. In Australia, it is known as acknowledgement of country when given by a non-Aboriginal person, and a welcome to country when given by an Aboriginal person. While in Canada, there is not an official term, it is generally described as a traditional territory acknowledgement. So for the sake of my thesis and the work that's followed, I made the decision to use Indigenous land acknowledgement to refer to United States context. Although it might have made sense to use the same terminology as Canada for continuity, as we are also part of what we recognize today as North America. However, the use of the word territory could be misleading within the United States context. To prevent confusion with the 16 US territories, such as Puerto Rico, American Samoa, Guam, Northern Mariana Islands, and the US Virgin Islands, I decided to substitute the word land. And I just really want to make it clear that this is an Indigenous protocol. Though I have been privileged to have the time and resources to do this work and the platform to share it, there have been countless other Indigenous activists, scholars, community members who have been doing this work and advocating for the adoption of this practice for generations long before I began this project. There are many critiques of the practice, and I fully understand those, and I think they're valid, but I believe Indigenous land acknowledgements are a crucial manifestation of survivance, which is a term that was coined by Anishinaabe scholar Gerald Visner and refers to an active sense of presence, the continuance of Native stories, not mere reaction or a survivable name. Native survivance stories are renunciations of dominance and tragedy and victimry. So it's an active survival, it's an action. So now more to why museums. In my thesis, I argue that museums and any institution that took part in the salvage collecting of the late 19th and early 20th centuries are uniquely responsible for the adoption of Indigenous land acknowledgements. So this also includes universities, libraries, and archives. For those of you who are not familiar with the term salvage collecting, it is based on the salvage paradigm, which is a term that was coined by James Clifford and refers to the widely held belief of the 19th and early 20th centuries that Indigenous people would inevitably disappear or go extinct. And so anthropologists scrambled to collect as many Native cultural material, both tangible and intangible. So intangible includes like wax cylinder recordings of language, songs, stories. And this was all done in an effort to save these cultures via documentation and placing them into repositories that we now know as museums, university collections, libraries, archives. It's important to note that many of these items were taken without permission and others were taken under extreme pressure or in times of financial duress. Ironically, the scramble to save Native culture was happening alongside the implementation of very strict assimilationist policies that sought to erase Native culture, such as the residential school system. Additionally, many museums have been erected on land that is essential to the identity and worldview of Indigenous people. Yet the truth about colonization, displacement, and the devastating effect that forced relocation has had on Native American communities is not frequently discussed in historical narratives or within the walls of museums. And because these stories are left out, many people are not even aware of the existence of local Indigenous communities. There are over 560 federally recognized tribes. That doesn't include state recognized or those that go unrecognized. And before coming to Santa Fe, in my experience, the average person could name maybe 5 to 10 of these tribes. So it's important to think about who benefits from these silences and erasures, this partial or one-sided version of the historical record that has led to the development of an American mythology which continues to support systemic racism toward Indigenous, Black, and other communities of color. One of my, a scholar that I reference a lot in my work, she is Maori, Dr. Linda Tuiwai Smith. This is a quote that I like to share from her. She said, "The collective memory of imperialism has been perpetuated through the ways in which knowledge about Indigenous peoples was collected, classified, and then represented in various ways back to the West, and then through the eyes of the West, back to those who have been colonized." So through their predatory collecting practices and the display of objects to represent entire groups of people, museums have played a role in colonization and participated in the development of that popular historical narrative, which has left out many voices and difficult truths, thereby causing great harm to Indigenous people. Therefore, it is the obligation of these institutions to make reparations by using their power to rewrite mainstream historical narratives and give voice and authority to groups that have been excluded. I believe that one very small but tangible way that museums can start to move in that direction is by acknowledging the communities that have an inseparable connection to the land on which they reside. Additionally, museums and collecting institutions have perpetuated ideologies related to manifest destiny, Western notions of private property, and terra nullius, which means nobody's land in Latin, has been used to justify the taking of land by deeming it unoccupied or uninhabited. So the perpetuation of these ideologies within cultural institutions has proven to be harmful because museums are perceived to be objective temples of knowledge within our society. According to the American Alliance of Museums, the American public considers museums the most trustworthy source of information in America, rated higher than local papers, nonprofit researchers, the US government, and academic researchers. Museums are considered a more reliable source of historical information than books, teachers, or even personal accounts by relatives. Therefore, to me, because museums uphold and perpetuate these colonial ideologies, and because of their great influence in society, it is no doubt that museum representations of Indigenous people and US mythology have contributed to policies and practices that have negatively affected Indigenous peoples. Most people are not aware of the shocking amount of land that was taken from Native people over time, some via treaties, some without, and many treaties were also signed under extreme pressure, similar to the collection of cultural material. So I like to use this graphic here to demonstrate what that looked like. When the General Allotment Act of 1834 or the Dawes Act was passed, 138 million acres of Native land were divided up into individual parcels of 160 acres per Native individual in an attempt to force Native Americans to adopt the Western notion of private property. The land that was not divided into the individual parcels was deemed surplus and sold off, so that resulted in the loss of over half of the 160 million acres. Museums not only have a habit of leaving this history out, but like I said, they uphold ideologies that justify the taking of Native land, such as terra nullius. Some people might say that this is in the past or it's history. However, the current day examples of Indigenous struggles against extractive industries on ancestral lands such as Standing Rock, Bears Ears, and Chaco Canyon demonstrate that these ideologies continue to persist in contemporary struggles around the recognition of Native territory. As educational institutions, it's the ethical obligation of museums and other collecting institutions to create truthful, factual, and equitable representations. Though land acknowledgements might seem like a small step, I believe that since these institutions seem to remain stagnant, unfortunately, It is a necessary first step that will lead to more significant commitments to decolonial practices. Further, I now believe it is the responsibility of all collecting institutions to implement this protocol, not just those who have a history of salvage collecting. So that includes contemporary art museums. All of these institutions have the power to shape perspectives about history and culture, regardless of what they display. And they are part of a larger system that has perpetuated and benefited from systemic racism and inequality. Another quote that I really love from Linda Tweed Weiss-Smith, she said, "Telling our stories from the past, reclaiming the past, giving testimony to the injustices of the past are all strategies which are commonly employed by Indigenous peoples struggling for justice. On the international scene, it is extremely rare and unusual when Indigenous accounts are accepted and acknowledged as a valid interpretation of what has taken place. And yet, the need to tell our stories remains the most powerful imperative of sorry, I got this quote scrambled up, but you guys get the idea. So during my research, I had the opportunity to speak with several museum professionals. And one of the most significant conversations I had was with Dina Dart, who is also Chumash and a former SAR scholar. So she shared a quote with me that really stood out. She said, "For museums to stop doing harm is the first step. And right now, currently, many of them are continuing to do harm. So these acknowledgements are a first step that compel museums to recognize that harm, hopefully. So I really want to make it clear that land acknowledgements themselves are not decolonizing. Implementing an acknowledgement protocol at an institution is not the end-all be-all solution. Rather, it is a verbal commitment to the implementation of decolonial practices that will begin to address the legacies of settler colonialism. It is meant to create a sense of institutional accountability." So these acknowledgements have become more popular among museums and other collecting institutions in the United States over the last couple of years. But these acknowledgements have actually been continuing the harm in a lot of cases, and I can speak to that personally because I've experienced it. Oftentimes, institutions and individuals have looked to Indigenous people to create their acknowledgement statements, even if they don't work for that particular institution. So this is not meaningful collaboration when Indigenous peoples are not compensated for their work as consultants. In fact, it devalues the intellectual contributions of Indigenous people. I found that oftentimes institutions assume that the acknowledgement in itself is payment, which it isn't. Further, it demonstrates a discontinued interest in actually learning about Indigenous communities among settlers who are unwilling to do the work. These statements benefit the institution or individual by giving the illusion of interest in Indigenous issues. They do not represent meaningful change. So my next questions that I've been working on to address within the work that I do are, how do we correct the labor imbalance created by the expectation that Indigenous peoples write acknowledgement scripts for non-Indigenous people to read? And what are some concrete, actionable measures that cultural institutions, specifically museums, could take that represent an interest in dismantling the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism? I don't have the answers. These are just things that I'm thinking about. Definitely, I think there needs to be more Indigenous representation across all areas of museums. So curation, education, leadership, board, I think that's definitely a first step. But again, I don't have the answers to these questions. So just to wrap up here, I wanted to connect this topic to a bigger picture of the effects of colonial narratives. This topic is particularly relevant during the current moment in regard to the conversations that people are having about problematic monuments. The reason that these monuments are so contentious is because they are a manifestation of the subjective nature of history. In the United States, the dominant historical narrative is told from a colonial perspective that often leaves out dark truths about the violence and discrimination that has been inflicted upon communities of color, often at the hands of the individuals who have been memorialized and celebrated via these monuments on ancestral Indigenous land. Why are people taught the history of these problematic settlers and conquistadors, but have little to no knowledge of local Indigenous communities? So these conversations are about who has had the power to shape the dominant historical narrative, the one that is taught in schools and museums, and it is about who has benefited from this particular framing of history and who has been marginalized as a result of the truths that have been left out. So these acknowledgements are just one tiny step toward addressing that. They demonstrate the institution is ready to start respecting Indigenous perspectives, Indigenous truths, and that the institution is committing to implementing further meaningful change. However, in the same way that many institutions have been criticized in recent weeks for posting statements in solidarity with Black Lives Matter with no evidence of actions that align with the sentiment in those statements, the acknowledgement statement is the first step, and it is a commitment to reflect on the colonial nature of collecting institutions. It's a commitment to implementing more meaningful change than just a statement. So unless we begin to go down this path, museums and other collecting institutions, for the most part, do not have the trust of Indigenous peoples because of their history of harm. Land acknowledgement is the most basic, actionable first step that these institutions can take toward repairing that relationship. And I just want to clarify in all of this, I'm not talking about MIAC in particular. I spoke on a panel a few months ago about the lasting impact of Here, Now, and Always, which I believe has successfully incorporated Indigenous perspectives and ways of knowing more successfully than other museums, but that's a whole different conversation. So that's all I have for you guys. So I just want to say Kakinash, thank you for attending.
Okay, at this time, if anybody has any questions, please enter them in the question and answer box at the bottom of your screen. Felicia, we'll just give them a minute or so to see if we have any questions, okay?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, I don't see anything coming in, so I think that means that we might be finished. Oh, wait, I just got some. Kara asks, what is the next step we can take to get further involved in giving the land back to its people?
I think that is a question that I am not equipped to answer, but I think the most basic first step is establishing an understanding of the history of the land, who that land ancestors belong to, and the connection between Indigenous people to that place. I don't think we can really start to have conversations about, land back or giving Indigenous people back their land without establishing that really basic understanding on a widespread scale. So, I mean, as far as like legislation and the legal issues surrounding transfer of land, I don't have the answers to that, but I think, we can't even really go there unless we start to establish an understanding about these more basic issues.
Okay, what would you recommend for institutions after land acknowledgement?
So I think that, like I said, I think it's really important for institutions to hire not just Indigenous people, but people of color in every single department of the museum. I know it can be really exhausting being the only Indigenous person or the only person of color at an institution and feeling like even if it's not in your job description, you have to be the one to constantly educate other departments about these issues. So I think it's important to hire people in all areas of these institutions so that the work isn't all put on one person. And also, again, I see another question about consulting. Pay people of color for the work that they do to address these issues. I think that is really important. Like I said, I think institutions tend to believe that like holding trainings or providing information about land acknowledgement or things like that is payment in itself, but it's really not. And so I think that is a first step. I think beginning to establish relationships with your local Indigenous community is really important, and not just as consultants, but genuine relationships where they have authority, they have a voice. And again, if you are asking them to perform a service, that they are paid as the experts that they are. So I think that that is really important, but also just to be aware that, like I said, Indigenous people don't have a lot of trust for museums because of this history of harm. So it might take a lot of time, it might take a lot of work, and just be patient and understanding if Indigenous people aren't ready to work with you quite yet. I think that just means you need to demonstrate first that your intentions are good and that you are willing to do the work and willing to cede authority to these communities.
Okay. We don't have any other questions right now. Just several people thanking you for the wonderful lecture.
I think I have
So,
that maybe you don't see. I'll just read them really quick. Sally is asking about any consulting work in the Santa Fe area. I have a full-time job at School for Advanced Research, but I'm happy to have a conversation about what I do in my spare time outside of work. Feel free to get in touch with me. There is an email address on the guide. I think it's landacknowledgementguide@gmail.com. You can contact me there. But I also know there are like other Indigenous consulting firms. I know Dina Dart has her own firm. She's based in Oregon, and so I don't know how far her reach is. I think she does do work all across the United States. So I mean, you can ask me about that in that email, and I will try to provide the information for her consulting firm. But there definitely are Indigenous people out there who are willing to do this work and paid as consultants. And then Matthew Martinez, he said, I appreciate your point about land acknowledgement being tied to action. This is key. This seems like a logical step for K through 12 schools to pursue as part of their curriculum. Do you know how many schools, do you know any schools engaging in these practices, models? I am unaware, but for my thesis, I did some research about what is happening in Canada, because I think, you know, Canada obviously has its own issues in terms of the relationship with Indigenous people, but they are a little bit further ahead of us in terms of acknowledgement practices. And there are a lot of K through 12 schools who incorporate this in their everyday activities. Like in an entire school district in Canada, during the morning announcement, a student reads a land acknowledgement, and it's not only an acknowledgement, it's information about the history of the land that the school is on, about the treaties. And so I think if we're looking for schools that are engaging in these practices, looking to schools that have good models, I think looking at Canada is probably the best bet. Yeah, and I just see some comments thanking me. So thank you all for attending. I'm really appreciative to have this audience. And again, you can reach out to me via the email on my guide. It's just at the very bottom there if you have any questions or want to be in touch.
Felicia, how about one more question?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, and then we'll wrap it up. What tools or protocols would you recommend for institutions to think outside the box for these acknowledgements? You mentioned in the beginning that a lot of these fall into cookie cutter formats, and the first one you showed from Miranda Roberts and others are more expansive in their support of other marginalized communities and in their asks for support. What do you recommend for folks looking to expand their acknowledgements to include these?
I think for me, something to keep in mind is an action. You know, what do you want people to get out of this statement? Like, who is your audience and what do you want them to do? So like with the Council for Museum Anthropology acknowledgement, our audience was museum professionals, and we really wanted them to take the time while they're here on Pueblo land to visit institutions and learn about those people. You know, it's not enough to acknowledge, you should take the time to go beyond that. And so I think I think what you have to consider is what you want people to get out of it, what action you want to inspire, and then also just to really do research on the place that you are giving that acknowledgement. Really reflect on the stories that are often told out of the history of that place, and just think about like what you want to share about that place. You know, it doesn't have to just, like in Miranda's example, it doesn't have to just focus on Indigenous people. I know a lot of places on the East Coast, there's a couple of universities who have begun to acknowledge how they have benefited from slavery in the past in their acknowledgements. And I think that's really important. I think, you know, it's not enough to just reflect on a small part of an institution or a place's history. We have to think about all of the silences that are left out of the history of that particular place. And it's, you know, our great privilege to have platforms to do acknowledgements and share that history and inspire people to take action. Let's see, I have another question here.
I'll
Next
go
time,
for it.
talk about guides for individuals rather than institutions. How should we as individuals behave, which goes beyond acknowledgement/donations? Yeah, I mean, I would love to talk more about that. But again, I think it's kind of the same thing. It's like, just be really mindful of where you're at, reflect on what a privilege it is to be a guest in that place, and really commit some time to doing research, learning about the Indigenous people, learning about the history of that place. And I think like as we've experienced recently, just learning more, taking the time to self-educate inspires action. Like I know myself, I've been doing a lot of work about like anti-racism, and that is something that I will admit I haven't spent a lot of time researching in the past, but it has inspired a lot of action on my part. And so I think just like taking the time to learn and reflect will point you in a direction for how you should act as an individual and the kinds of actions that are going to be helpful. So I think that's it.
Okay, I think that's it, Felicia. So thank you so much for joining us for this week's webinar. Next week, again, we have Angelo Baca talking about Bears Ears National Monument. Thank you and have a good day.
Thank you.